Okay, let's continue on with the brain. This would be 203 brain 3. This should be the last of the brain videos. Okay, I think we left off here. Cerebellum, cells more than half granule, and for kids you don't have to worry about naming cells in the cerebellum. Monitoring muscle contractions. It knows, it gets proprioceptive information. I think I mentioned this before. From all the muscles in your body, it knows this is where you are in space. So as I said, I could do this. And that's part of a drug test. Be pulled over because your motor coordination goes out the window if you really have too much to drink, and you won't hit your nose. So its biggest role is in motor coordination, making smooth motor functions, and exploring objects by touch, knowing what something is just by touching with it. And something that the book doesn't mention, and I learned from another book I read about the brain, it inhibits self-touching. In other words, you touch yourself, I can feel that I'm touching myself, but it's not as intense. It's not as strong as someone else touching you. So apparently your brain thinks that somebody else touching you or something else touching you is much more important than touching yourself. This is why you can't tickle yourself, for the most part. I think maybe if I move fingers gently over my feet, sometimes I feel a little bit of tickle. But regular tickle, you can't tickle yourself because the intensity is not enough. But other people can. So then the other side is, well, then if your cerebellum inhibits self-touching, why can we do one thing? As I always ask the class. And don't be embarrassed about it. Masturbation. How come we can masturbate if the cerebellum inhibits self-touching? But it isn't inhibited that much that we can still do that. Anyway, it's not something important. Okay, proprioceptive information. Oh, I just mentioned the proprioceptive information from all of the muscles. The muscle spindle fibers are telling the cerebellum how contracted they are and therefore where they are in space. All right. Timekeeping is a little bit of a timekeeping, a little bit of language discrimination, a little bit of planning and scheduling tasks in the cerebellum. And so primary movements. The primary motor cortex and cerebral nuclei within the cerebellum send nerve signals through the nuclei of the pons to the cerebellum. So remember, the motor cortex contacts the cerebral nuclei to disinhibit muscles, and they send information to the and also information is sent to the cerebellum. The motor cortex wants to know where your body parts are in space. So if you can do something from different positions, you have to contract muscles in different order and different strength. Assessment of voluntary movements. Proprioception and skeletal muscles and joints send sensory information regarding the degree of movement to the cerebellum. That's the yellow coming up. That's the proprioception. Integration analysis. The cerebellum compares the planned movements against the results of the actual movements. So the cerebellum, so I'm planning to pick up my cup and drink some tea. That's what I'm planning. Okay, cerebellum has got it mapped out. What muscles do I got to contract? How do I, in what order, to go over and pick it up and drink from it? Corrective feedback. The cerebellum sends nerve signals through the thalamus to the primary cortex to motor nuclei in the brainstem. So it calculates the what needs to be done, what muscles to be contracted when, and it sends that information to the motor cortex. And the basic nuclei have disinhibited those muscles so they can be contracted. So smooth muscle motion is all communication between the motor cortex, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. We go into the limbic system. We're going back to the cerebrum now, and it's the oldest part. And it's really, you can think of it as what called a reptile brain. It's, as I mentioned before in the first parts of these lectures, the brain is still got really ancient parts to it. It's just, it's built on the ancient amphibian reptile brain, and things have been added up to it. But those old parts are still there. So the cingulate gyrus connects the limbic system to the frontal lobe. And we're going to be talking about socialization. How do we deal in a proper social situation? Because human beings are incredibly social. And what happens is in the amygdala here, emotional center of the brain, you get these strong emotions that could be positive or negative, and these and then you get these emotions, and they're sent through a cingulate gyrus to the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe decides what to do about it, how to act from this. For example, you piss off a reptile, he's going to bite you. There's no thinking about it. So, what's the proper response? Attack. But human beings are social. What's the appropriate response to this? That somebody you get makes you angry or makes you happy or whatever. And it's a communication between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. The hippocampus converts short-term memory to long-term memory. That's in the limbic system. Also, I always say this is a really important area for students because you got to convert the short-term memory into the long-term memory for the exam. And also, the hippocampus is one of the rare parts of the brain where you can actually make new cells. Those cells are mitotic, that you can add to them. That and your olfactory epithelium. Those are the only two places where you can make new nerve cells, once you're an adult, that is. The olfactory areas, the fornix connections to the hypothalamus. This is, smell, when we get to the senses, we'll find that it's the only one, it's the oldest sense, most primitive sense. And it's the only one that doesn't go through the thalamus. It goes right to the limbic system. So, in a sense, it's the most emotional of senses. And we can talk about emotional senses. And what's it going to say? Oh, and it relates to memory because the hippocampus is there, and so you can have smelled something that you haven't smelled for many decades, and all of a sudden it brings you back a whole flood of memories from when this last smell was, when you last smelled this particular odor. Okay, the gratification and aversion centers. Nucleus accumbens is nearby the ventral tegmental area, and nucleus accumbens is in the limbic system. And this is the pleasure area. This makes you feel good. And with experiments with rats, they would put an electrode into the nucleus accumbens, and then a little switch that would stimulate the nucleus accumbens. And once by chance the rat or the mouse detects that switch, they keep on going back to it again and again and again, and they don't think of anything else. They don't worry about food or water or sex anymore. It's just pushing that lever because it makes them feel so good. And when something makes you feel happy, these areas light up, and it is the gratification centers. You feel gratified, and you're likely to do it again if it makes you feel really good. Sometimes it works against you with illegal drugs, but integrative functions. Sleep. It's like 5 stages of sleep, and you cycle through these over the course of the night several times. I think, and you don't even, I need to know the different cycles, and it's really, really deep sleep and lighter sleep. And then there's REM and non-REM sleep, rapid eye movement. That's the lightest form of sleep. And it's when you're dreaming. And you have to dream. People have let people, sleep researchers have let people sleep but interrupt their dreaming and don't let them dream. And it's like you never even slept at all. So dreaming is incredibly important, and you have about 4 or 5 dreams every night. You don't remember them though, unless you wake up in the middle of the dream or just a few minutes after, because um, you forget the dream really early. And also, when you're dreaming, you are paralyzed. You cannot move your muscles. Your whole motor system is shut down because, I mean, skeletal muscle. I don't mean like diaphragm or heart or something. I mean, skeletal muscles in your arms and legs. You can't move because if you try to act out that, you could get really injured. Sleepwalkers, they're not dreaming when they're sleepwalking. They're in a different stage of sleep when they're not paralyzed. And then the function is really unknown. It's a really amazing thing. We spend a third of our lives or more asleep, and we don't know why. It's there's a bunch of good hypotheses, you know, of consolidating memories, putting together the day, sorting things out. Because oftentimes the dreams have something to do with something you did that day, you know, sometimes. But also remember, it's also cleaning the brain. Now we know about this lymphatic circulation of cerebrospinal fluid actually cleans out these toxic proteins out of your brain. So there's a definite reason for sleep. But it is actually essential for life. If you don't sleep, you'll die. You have to sleep. Okay, cognition. So association areas. This is where cognition is really associating different things, putting things together, figuring things out. And highest brain function, but least understood. And it's a distributed function. It's like all over the brain. We don't know where. It's widely distributed across the brain. And it doesn't depend upon how many brain cells you have. Human brains range all the way from like 900 cc's to 1500 cc's. But just because you have more cells doesn't mean you're smarter. What leads to being able to really figure things out is the connections in the brain. How many connections you make. And that's part of learning is actually making more and more connections between different neurons. Okay, cognition known mostly from damage to areas. Damage to parietal lobes leads to contralateral neglect, where you neglect part of your body. Damage to temporal lobes leads to agnosia, which I think is, I think what agnosia is. Hang on a second. Yeah, agnosia is the ability to recognize things, interpret sensations, and recognize things. And then damage to frontal lobes leads to personality disorders. And that is becoming wild and crazy or mild and gentle, just changing your whole personality, but damage to the frontal lobes. And we'll talk about that a little bit in frontal lobotomies. People used to do frontal lobotomies, where you have these wild, crazy people who listen to stuff, they bring them in and have the frontal lobes severed, and they become really nice and gentle and respectful and wouldn't be wild and crazy anymore. And they said that as a matter of course. Okay, memory. Again, it's associative function widely distributed, you know, where it is. Declarative and procedural. Declarative is facts, knowing facts and figures. Procedural is motor, you know, like I said, riding a bicycle, playing a violin, whatever. Amnesia, integrate and retrograde. Integrate is the inability of making new memories. Retrograde, I think, is the loss of old memories. In the hippocampus, now there was a case of a guy whose hippocampus was destroyed by a virus, I think. And he lived every day like it was brand new. If you met him that day, talked with him, you come back the next day, he doesn't remember you because he can't form new memories. He can't consolidate. He can't turn short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay, sensory memory is really, really short-term memory, just a couple of seconds. Short-term is like a few minutes, and then long-term memory um, is remembering it for years, decades. Um, so conversion from short-term memory to long-term memory encoding, memory consolidation requires, as I said, hippocampus and amygdala, both in. And it's stored in different areas, and nobody knows really where their memory is stored. So sensory input input sensory memory really quickly fail to remember. Deliver to short-term memory. You practice. You can a little bit of it, and then but after a short time, it's just a few minutes, you fail to remember. And you deliver to long-term memory by practicing, see over and over again, and eventually you'll convert it to long-term memory. As I mentioned, emotion arises from amygdala and hypothalamus, output to lower brain centers, and then output the prefrontal cortex as a decision as how to respond to emotions. As I mentioned before, via the cingulate gyrus, these strong emotions come up and they go into the frontal lobe, and you decide what to do about this in a socially acceptable way. And that's what's wrong with psychopaths. There's something wrong there. Their frontal lobe is not working properly. They have no empathy for other people, and therefore they do terrible things. And sometimes it's due to just an organic thing. It just their frontal lobe didn't develop properly, or they have a miserable childhood. This is why some people commit murders. The defense attorney says, well, he was abused as a child, and he was beat up and in a terrible childhood, and that's why he's a terrible person. Because when you're like a tabula rasa, you're an empty slate sort of in your brain when you're a little child. You think you're the top of the world, and then you learn to be emphatic with good help from your parents and saying, look, if you're not nice to people, people won't be nice to you. The golden rule. And we learn from our parents how to deal with other people. Okay, again, the reward and pleasure centers, medium forebrain bundle. It's called the ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens. And we talked about lobotomies before. The old lobotomies would just go in there and slice, separate you. Take out the lobe altogether, just slice the hippocampus and the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. And there was a guy named Walter Friedman who used to go around. He was a traveling lobotomist. He'd go along, and if some go from town to town, and if parents are having trouble with boisterous kids, they bring them in there, and he'd do a lobotomy on them in a motel room with an ice pick up into the eyebrow, stick an ice pick up in and just move it back and forth. And this happened, and this was going on until the 1970s. Okay, the new lobotomy is just with a laser, they cook the cingulate gyrus. And they don't do lobotomy very much anymore, but occasionally they do. And then they just go in there and destroy the cingulate gyrus, and now the limbic system cannot communicate with the frontal lobe. Well, here's the hypothalamus. This is more the called the hedonistic highway. Also, the gratification reward center from the hypothalamus, enkephalins to the ventral tegmental area, to substantia nigra and amygdala, to the hippocampus, and down here is to the nucleus accumbens, when we have enkephalins and GABA giving us this reward, this gratification. Okay, remember language, focus areas, motor speech, And Wernicke's area, understanding speech. Most people, they are both in the left hemisphere. And there's a motor speech area and Wernicke's area right there. And auditory information about a sentence travels to the primary auditory cortex. Information from the Wernicke area travels to the motor speech area. Information travels from the motor speech area to the primary motor cortex, where motor commands and bony muscles used for speech are given. So from the primary auditory cortex to Wernicke's area, from Wernicke's area to Broca's area, and then to the motor cortex. Okay, the cranials. So we're going to go over these. You don't have to memorize all these, but they're important to know about. There's 12 cranial nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they all stay right in the head neck area except one, and that's important. The vagus nerve is the only one that travels outside the head neck area and innervates many organs in your body. It's a big parasympathetic nerve, and it really is remember we haven't gotten to the autonomic nervous system. Finding the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic is cranial sacral. So those nerves come out of the cranium, the vagus, or come out of the sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay, so one is olfactory, sensory smell. One's optic, sensory vision. When I say sensory, I mean sensory or motor or mixed. So a nerve that just carries sensory information, it is sensory. Carry information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Motor is the opposite, from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. So a nerve that could be purely and there's very few that are purely sensory or purely motor. Most of them are mixed. Sensory information coming one way, motor information right next door, and other axons going in the other direction. But olfactory and optic, they're pretty much pure sensory. Oculomotor is almost pure motor, extrinsic eye muscles, all right, showing where to point your eyes. A trochlear is also pretty much pure motor, extrinsic eye muscles again, that's number 4. Then trigeminals is big nerve that has 3 branches: ophthalmic, sensory touch pain from temperature pain from face; maxillary, sensory sensation of lower face; and mandibular, mixed face sensation and mastication. Then 6 is abducens, it's another extrinsic eye muscle, control motor. 7 is facial. It's mixed, got taste, facial expression, tears. 8 is vestibulocochlear, sensory, for the most part, hearing and equilibrium, but there's a small part of it that's motor that we'll talk about in the senses chapter. 9 is glossopharyngeal, mixed taste, sensation from tongue and outer ear, blood pressure, breathing regulation, salivation, swallowing, gagging. So here's some visual sense, right? Blood pressure. And there's 10, vagus, mixed taste, hunger and satiation, swallowing, regulation of smooth muscle in many systems, parasympathetic, and also input from baroreceptors. Oh, receptors is misspelled. Baroreceptors and chemoreceptors for regulation of blood pH and blood pressure. 11, accessory, motor, swallowing, head, neck, and shoulder muscles. And finally, 12 is hypoglossal, motor, tongue movements for speech, food manipulation, and swallowing. So that's more like a pure motor nerve. So those are them. There's just a few things you need to know about those. Like the vagus is the only one that goes out of the head neck region, and most of them are there's some pure sensory. You should know about the olfactory and optic certainly, and a little bit about the trigeminal. But all the rest, I'm not going to ask you specifically what a cranial nerve 9 does or something. Okay. And that's it, folks. for the brain. We're all finished with this chapter. Again, remember, this is going to be 203 brain 3. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now and see you later.